PowerTalks series. Very happy to introduce our annual event of the year in review. Dr. James Cimino. Dr. James Cimino, very well known to many of us. We can make this really quick. In addition to being, he's an internist, he's informaticist, faculty at Columbia University, and leader, educator, researcher, applied, and also known for his desiderata work. And he was at the NLM, where he developed Beatrice, which is an NIH-wide clinical research data source, and he's co-editor with Edward Shortliff of one of the most prominent textbooks in biomedical informatics since 2015. He's been at UAB, where he was the inaugural director of the Informatics Institute, and his mission is to reinvent the EHR, help people find the information they need to make decisions. And he's a fellow of ACME, and past president, and also we've got numerous awards. We're not even going to go into that, including the Morris F. Collin Award, one of the highest awards in our field. And without further ado, the Bioinformatics Year in Review.
Thanks, Amy. That was a great intro. Usually people run on and like you don't know what I do, but that was well focused. So I'm going to jump
in. People off when they went too long.
It's not that I don't like it. It's just yours was more helpful than most. So let me jump right into this. Some of you know, the American Medical Informatics Association just had their annual symposium last week in Washington, D.C. And I was tasked with providing a summary of the year in review of significant papers in biomedical informatics. So let me just get started, make sure I'm on the right thing here. Okay, usual disclosures. I'm supported by NLM, R21, and then other grants. Learning objectives. You should have a sense of the scope of informatics research. Think about AMIA working groups. I'll talk about them in a second, that match your interests and be inspired to publish significant work. So what I do is I ask the AMIA work groups, of which there are some 27 or so, to nominate papers in specific fields. So I don't pick the papers. I ask the working groups to pick papers they find significant, and then I review those and figure out which ones will be easy to present in 30 to 60 seconds as I go through them. And I just pick the interesting ones, not necessarily the most significant, but the ones that I could talk about in a short amount of time. I ask the authors for audiovisual material. Sometimes I get videos and things. It spices things up a little bit. I am not going to present all this information so that you will understand these papers when I'm done. That's just not possible, given the number of papers I'm going to cover. It's a guided tour to the slides, which I'll give you the link at the end, and you can always email me if you don't get the link. It's a guide to the slides and the papers, and you can go through those, the ones you're interested in, after. And then I try to make some sense of it all, sort of step back and say, well, what did we see this year that was different than previous years? And then at the end, if I have time, I'll talk about our process and go through acknowledgements and bibliography, but those are all on the slide. Okay, so just to orient you to the slides, the top, there'll be the name of the working group. The first slide will have the title and the journal. And then I like to list the first author and the senior author, because I never know who's the most important person. Sometimes I do, but I figure between the first one and the last one, I'm getting somebody that's relevant. And then the institution, or some of the institutions if there's multiple, and then I'll have summary points, and then I'll have more slides that may have some interesting observations, visual materials, summary, and I'll summarize honorable mention papers from other working groups. So I try to have one from every working group. I may have cut some out. This was a 90-minute talk last week, and so now it's a 60-minute talk. So let's see how we do. All right, so first was education. The education working group, and I like to think about education informatics as having a number of different perspectives. So you can teach about informatics, and so that's just informatics education. So like an introduction to informatics, and we got 2 papers in that category. And I want to compare informatics to ethanol. So we can teach about ethanol. We can have biochemistry lectures, pharmacology lectures, lectures on addiction medicine. Teach us about sort of what it is and what it does and what it doesn't do and what its harms are and so on. Okay, then we can train people to use these things. So that's informatics education. Also, in informatics, we teach people how to use PubMed or BLAST or electronic health records or various research repositories, that sort of thing. And of course, to teach people about ethanol, we have mixology to teach them how to bartend. Education, then there's professional development, turning people into informaticians. So we have master's degree, PhDs, fellowships, and I got 4 papers related to that. And of course, in ethanol, you can get master's, PhDs, and fellowships in biochemistry and pharmacology, and so on. And then teaching with the use of informatics. So really education informatics as opposed to informatics education. And so there's things like simulation, gamification, things where we're using informatics tools to actually teach anything, not necessarily informatics. And then you say, well, how do you use alcohol to teach? And for that, it's evening seminars where, okay, we're going to teach you about this, but we're going to have, we'll have open bar, or we'll have wine with dinner or something. So, sort of as a social lubricant. Okay. Education. So first one was engaging house staff as informatics collaborators, educational and operational opportunities, applied clinical informatics. Jared Sarensen, Matthew Eisenberg, and others at Stanford. And this was an interesting paper because they're engaging house staff as active participants in developing things to improve the system, the health system in general, but really computer systems, as if the house staff don't have enough to do, right? But they put an IT council together and they got them to work on all kinds of projects. 5 co-chairs, 50 members, 50 projects that affect their 3,000 staff members. And I won't go through all the projects. You can review the slides if you're interested. There's general things about order set review, mobile dictation. I have one screenshot though that I thought was interesting. So they made a software change to this system called Voalte, which is a system for contacting physicians. And they brought in the Epic treatment team information into Voalte so they could say, okay, who am I supposed to contact for this patient, and who's covering that person if I can't contact them? So it was an interesting way to bring these systems together. Okay, another education, data-driven assessment of U.S. health informatics programs and job market, applied clinical informatics, Jay Patel, Hwanmei Wu, Temple University. And this was they did a survey of the training information at 238 universities and 200 job listings to look at the skill sets and see how they match up. And what they found 94 universities with some kind of health informatics programs. And the job descriptions often ask for experience in database management and analytics. Only 58% of these 94 programs actually mention including those in their syllabus. They also, in general, lack training in socio-technical systems, social behavioral aspects of health, and interprofessional collaborative practice, which are actually well-recognized elements of informatics education. Okay, next one, I really like the education group, so I've got a lot of their slides. Early prediction of student learning performance through data mining and systematic review. So this paper actually doesn't count because it was published wasn't published in 2022 or even late 2021, but I put it in there because it's education informatics. So they found 82 papers where people were using informatics basically to predict student learning. They're using different data mining methods. And so I just wanted to put that in there, say, yeah, people really are using informatics to help with education. I don't remember what kind, it was all kinds of education, not medical necessarily. And then professional development. Betsy Humphreys, Richard Logan, I believe, and Roger Logan and Randy Miller, Elliot Siegel have a chapter in a book about Don Lindberg, basically transforming biomedical health informatics. And it's a terrific book. It's amazing to look at. Just look at the chapters. It's incredible. This guy's influence. Don Lindberg, former director of the National Library of Medicine. And so there's this chapter by Bob Green. Oh, no, they edited the book. Bob Greenis, Valerie Florence, Randy Miller. But Betsy Humphreys and others talk about the educational programs that he sponsored. And most notably, that's the cover of the book. Most notably is the informatics training programs. And back when he was director in the last round, this is where all the sites. There were 12 of them, 15, I guess. There are now 18. Alabama is not one of them. We were not successful, but next time we'll get in there next time. Okay, people, organizational issues, another working group, and they cover evaluation. So they looked at risk factors associated with medication ordering errors, and that's in JAMIA, generally American Medical Informatics Association, Joanna Abraham, Thomas Canampali at Washington University. And so they wanted to find medication orders that were errors. And, that's kind of subjective sometimes. So what they did was they looked for orders that were voided. They said, well, if these were voided, maybe they were voided because they were erroneous. And they found 1,074 voided errors, and they characterized 842 of them as being errors. And you'll see how they figured that out. 190, they actually made it as far as the patient. That is, the patient was impacted by the order. Fortunately, no harm was done. They did interviews with the people who wrote the orders, and that covered about 33% of all avoided orders. And they used an approach systems engineering initiative for patient safety approach. And this is just a screenshot that shows why they canceled the order. So wrong account or wrong patient, duplicate order system. So a lot of these are errors of some sort or another. And then they could, people could fill in the blank, of course, if they had another reason. And then this is just characterization of the order. So if you're interested in looking at characterization of the orders, I like this paper because of how creatively they discovered the errors. So take a look. Pharmacoinformatics, new drug design, avenues targeting Alzheimer's disease by pharmacoinformatics aided tools. And this is Lily Arrué, David Ramirez, and they're in Chile and Ireland. And so they looked at drug repurposing. They have a number of pharmacoinformatics tools and lots of nice graphics. And I mainly included this because they sent me this cool video. And so look on the left, you'll see a molecule moving up into a small molecule moving up into a protein. And now look at the center one. There's another one moving around. And I just like the videos to see what they can generate. And then on the right-hand side, those are molecules entering a membrane. You'll see them get sucked in periodically. All right, enough of that. Clinical research informatics, big area. And actually, I kept a lot of these from the 90-minute talk because it seems to be a big area that UAB is interested in. So clinical subphenotypes in COVID-19, derivation, validation, prediction, temporal patterns, interaction with social determinants of health, NPJ, digital medicine, Chang Su, Fei Wang at Weill Cornell Medicine. And so they use machine learning on the routinely collected data for patients with COVID-19. And they did an unsupervised learning method to divide them into natural phenotypes. And they came up with 4 phenotypes. And these phenotypes use different biomarkers and different comorbidities to create 4 different classes of patient. And these classes had distinct 60-day mortality, and they had distinct temporal patterns over the course of the pandemic, the 2 years that they looked at. And they also looked at mortality that was associated with social determinants within each of these phenotypes. So this is just on the 4 on the left are showing you the 4 phenotypes. And at the bottom is the phenotype, it's either blue or green or yellow or red. And then it's showing you on the left, it's showing you the biomarkers. So for instance, blue is a really good one to have. It has some inflammation, it's got some renal, but doesn't really have cardiac or hepatic. Green, a better one to have. And it's, it doesn't have the renal. Red, that's a bad one. And it's associated with lots of different comorbid biomarkers. And then on the 4 on the right, it's the same kind of graph, but again, now it's a different comorbidities. So different kinds of diseases associated with these phenotypes. And it's really remarkable to look at the difference between these phenotypes. So upper right, you see the mortality, survival probability, and you can see that red, if you were in that red category, you had a really high mortality, 75% mortality, whereas if in the blue category, you're doing pretty well. And then if you look on the upper right, you can see the appearance of these phenotypes over time. And I don't think they looked at the variants that were associated with this, but you could imagine different variants emerging, and the most recent variant may be less less virulent than previous ones. So very interesting to see these things over time. And then they also looked at social determinants of health and disease, and there were very definitely within each phenotype, there were differences in mortality that were stratified them separately based on these social determinants. Don't have time to go into them, but really cool thing to be looking at. Clinical research, informatics, honorable mention, differential privacy and health research. It's a scoping review, so they were just looking at what people wrote. Differential privacy, interesting idea. If you go to a repository like I2B2, typically the developers go through a lot of trouble to try to avoid letting you know who the person is. So they do things like obscure the dates, they shift the dates a little bit, they shift the values of the lab tests a little bit, but they do this around some random distribution that's normally distributed. So if you ask the same question 4 times and then take the mean of those 4 results, you'll get probably pretty close to the exact answer. And so to the extent that they're trying to hide dates and actual values, you can overcome that. So they were looking at differential privacy methods. And I just thought it was very interesting that they're really looking at this, and they found lots of publications on this. I mean, an inordinate 1,673 publications in 2020 that, which was the last year they looked at on this topic. So nice to know people are looking at that. Clinical research informatics, again, design and implementation of integrated data model to support clinical and translational research in administration. JAMIA, Elizabeth Wood, Thomas Campion Jr., Weill Cornell Medical College. And I included this one because it's a different type of informatics. It's the informatics of research administration, kind of like the informatics of billing in the healthcare system. But, they come up with a data model to manage all these aspects. And it's, it's pretty complicated. For instance, think about, we do this in the eMERGE. Who pays for the lab test that somebody has because they're in this research project and now they need a lab test? Would it be a routine lab test they would get anyway, or is it something that is related to the study and you got to figure out how to bill for it? So there are lots of different aspects of administration. They came up with a nice model for it. Nursing informatics, they always provide very well thought out, high quality selection of studies, very hard to trim them down. Use of machine learning to transform complex standardized nursing care plan data into meaningful research variables. So they use palliative care as an example. And basically what they do is they take the nursing care plan, which has lots of coded data, and try to turn those into research variables that could be used for research. And you'd say, well, that seems simple. Just, put it in your research study. What are they looking at? Well, nursing care plans are actually pretty complicated. They use the North American Nursing Diagnosis Association codes, 3,400 codes. They use the nursing outcome codes, almost 8,000 codes, and nursing intervention codes. There's over 12,000 of those. So there's something like 331 billion permutations of these codes. And so clearly they have to have some way to kind of boil it down to something that could be useful at the level of research variables. So they map these in the research framework for palliative care. And this is a care plan on the left, and you can see the nursing diagnosis, the nursing outcome, and the nursing intervention. And so the nursing diagnosis is death anxiety. So this is, if you look at patient lists, I don't think in all the years I've been writing diagnosis list, problem list, I don't think I'm sure I've never written death anxiety as a problem, but come on, it's a problem, and patients need to deal. I've written about anxiety, I've written about, terminal care and things like that, but putting it together, that's kind of the nurse perspective. And that's why I included this paper and spending a little extra time on it. And they look at the anxiety level as an outcome, and then there's an intervention, active listening. So these are all things that come like an orthogonal view of the patient and the care of that patient. Sometimes it's not even about the patient. Sometimes it's about the patient's support group, their family, that sort of thing. And then here's just some of the categories that they came up with in boiling these things down into things that could be translated into research variables. So I'll have to take a look at that. Okay, I'm going to talk about Friedman's fundamental theorem. Chuck Friedman, University of Michigan, came up with this idea of this fundamental theorem of biomedical informatics. JAMIA 2009, hang on to your hats here. It's very technical. Basically, it's this. A computer plus a human is better than a human. All right. I don't know if you've ever seen me work with computers, you might dispute this theory, but okay, computer plus human better than human. So the idea is that we can enhance what people do through the use of biomedical informatics. So hang on to that. Another way to think about it is to err is human, and a computer is required to really screw things up. All right, so a natural language processing group. This paper was also recommended by the clinical research informatics group, but I put it here because I've already done enough clinical research informatics. Combining human and machine intelligence for clinical trial eligibility querying. And JAMIA, this is by Yilu Fang and Chenhua Wang at Columbia University. They have a system called Criteria to Query. At version 1.0 generates database queries from clinical trial protocols. So it says, oh, I want to enroll people that have this disease and have this level of renal function and whatever. It turns those into queries that find people with certain ICD codes and certain creatinine levels and that sort of thing. The problem is that these criteria sometimes are difficult to not just to map, but even to find in the EHR. So for instance, patient willingness to withhold regular medication for 2 weeks. You're not going to find that in the EHR. So that's kind of an impossible one. But others are just really hard to find because they're not in the structured data, they're in the text data. And so they can use natural language processing to kind of differentiate between these difficult and impossible criteria. And so what criteria to query 2.0 does is it has a user interface that lets the users modify the criteria. And I'm going to skip the video. They have provided me with this video, but if you get the slides, I think that's a video, you can click on it and it's still there. And I'm going to skip right to this. Oh, I don't have the screenshot. I took out the screenshot. But basically what they did was they let humans sort of modify when they show the criteria, and then you can mark it up and go, yeah, this is a good one. They'll circle it or cross it out, say, no, this is not one that I want to do, and so on. And the idea then is together, the human and the computer working together, not only is better than the human, but it's better than the computer. So they showed that the human plus computer was better. The criteria 2.0, which allowed humans to participate, was better than human criteria 1.0. All right, we're going to come back to that. So natural language processing, another one, tasks as needed, reframing the paradigm of clinical natural language processing research for real world decision support. Asher Liederman, Karen Veerspoor, University of Melbourne. And I just like this diagram of the iceberg showing that administrative encoded structural data are the tip of the iceberg, and most of the data is down in the unstructured part of the record. So clinical natural language processing underperforms when you have complex language processing tasks. That is, you have, for instance, if you have like you're doing NLP on a mammogram result, that's pretty easy because there's a sublanguage there. It's very small, limited vocabulary. But if you're looking at a discharge summary, it's all over the place and trying to figure out all the things that are in there and all the terms and structure and abbreviations, and it's a nightmare. So natural language processing generally tends to simplify the problems into some goal-oriented task. And so what they did, and explainability then of course becomes difficult. What they did was they said, let's shift this to a set of tasks, individual tasks as decisions, but make them tasks as needs. And they break the problem down basically into small areas. And so it kind of makes sense. They say, we have one NLP task that's just find me stuff that's about social support at home. Find me another one that's about activities of daily living. Find me another one that's about evidence of infection. So these are all kind of the demon model, right? There's like all these little demons trying to figure out all different parts of the record, and then they each contribute their information. But as opposed to the demon model, where one is trying to overcome the others, they're all complementary, and each of them can perform better than the big system on the left. Are you trying to discharge the patient? Yes or no? An NLP test, that's a big task. But if you break it down into these little tasks, again, now the human can go, well, they have good social support and they're doing activities of daily living, but they still have a bad infection. So no, I'm not going to send them home. That's the idea. They talk about Friedman's fundamental theorem, which, kind of applies to everything in informatics, I suppose. I prefer this one. This is from a book by Marsden Blois, known as Scott Blois, Information in Medicine, Nature of Medical Descriptions, and published in 1984. Scott Blois was an oncologist who studied multiple myeloma, I believe, and or melanoma, I think melanoma, but he was also an informatician. And he put in his book this diagram, which did not have a whole lot of explanation, but I asked him about it when I was working with him a couple of years after the book was published. And the idea is that when there's a problem space that's very broad, like at point A, the humans are better than computers at figuring out how to narrow down the possibilities. So we look as pattern recognizers, we go, oh, you know what, this is an infection, this isn't cancer, or this isn't an infection, this is an autoimmune disease. That humans are good at that when we have expertise, at least in pattern recognition, that we can't even explain, and we can't explain it to computers, we can't write algorithms to do it. And then when you get down to the narrow end, the computers are better because they can do things like precisely calculate dose or eliminate, take a limited differential diagnosis and tell you which one is most likely based on, a knowledge base, that kind of thing. And so the idea was that humans are better at the left side at A and computers are better at the right side. That was 1984. All right, so here we are 38 years later, and I think that things have changed a little bit. And so now we have all of these expert systems, machine learning, deep learning, all these things that are actually really good at narrowing things. They're good at filtering and figuring out how to categorize things down to a narrow level. And so the computer actually can do better out here because it can work on lots of data. It doesn't rely on anecdotal experience, but rather broad data sets. And so it can be really good at figuring out which thing to bring to bear at the point of care. Now, when they fail spectacularly. They can be way off. But most of the time they're pretty good. And when they're way off, it's usually obvious. The humans will go, oh yeah, that's completely wrong. And so that's where the human comes in over here. The human does better because now they've got this thing that narrowed it down for them, and then they can figure out how to apply it in a practical environment. Okay, and that's what I see with that natural language processing. All right, so open source working group. They talked about open source automated insulin delivery in type 1 diabetes. This was the New England Journal of Medicine, Mercedes Burnside, Martin DeBach, University of Otago, New Zealand. And this is one of the papers that I had read beforehand, knew about because it was fascinating. So there are, insulin pumps, and there are insulin sensors, and the insulin pumps can, change the dose of insulin they're giving based on what the sensors do, but they don't have any software built into them to do anything fancy. And part of the reason is that they would involve FDA regulation. But people sell open source software freely available. They don't sell, they make it freely available. I guess it's open source. You put it on your phone and it picks up the glucose information and it transmits it to the pump, and it can do some interesting things. So it can do, so they did a controlled trial of a continuous glucose monitor and insulin pumps, and they looked at their application, which predicts low glucose and suspends insulin delivery before the low glucose occurs. And they compared that to a manual pump management based on alarms. And so there's the sensor augmented control system. That's the control group. And then they have this thing, you put it on your phone, and this is the software on the phone. And what they found was these diagrams are not glucose levels, which looks like the blue in the left. The blue is the open source thing. So it looks like, oh, it didn't do as well. No. This is the percent time where people were in range. So being at 100% is good here. You want to be at 100%. So you can see the blue definitely keep people in range. And then on the other side, it's the mean time and target glucose range. For some reason, they switched the colors. So now blue is the control group. But again, you can see the assisted group is doing better than the control group. Device-related adverse events were low in both groups. Okay, sepsis and machine learning. So sepsis, been writing about that. There's publications indexed in Medline back to 1967 when Medline started indexing things online. And now we get about 10,000 articles a year. Machine learning, of course, relatively newer, but we get about 20,000 a year of those. And when you add them together, you get a fair number, and it's increasing every year. Why do I do this? Well, because sepsis is a really interesting problem to look at with machine learning. Because when somebody has sepsis, you go, oh, they have sepsis, and you go, yeah, yesterday they looked pretty bad. They're starting to get a fever, or they're shaking, or something. And I should have known, or maybe you couldn't know. But there are subtle signs that, taken together, when you have enough data, machine learning can be very good at predicting sepsis. And so there was a couple of papers on that. One, there's this knowledge discovery data mining group, sepsis subphenotyping based on organ dysfunction trajectory, critical care. Zhengxing Xu and Fei Wang at Weill Cornell Medical Center. And if you don't remember them, you will. They developed 72 sequential organ failure assessment scores, 72 different scores, and then they clustered the scores based on the trajectory to organ failure. Okay, so these graphs looking a little familiar here. They looked at these, they grouped them into these different phenotypes, and they showed that some progress to failure and others do not progress to failure as much. Again, and they break down really well related to various biomarkers and comorbidities. So an interesting use of machine learning. And then this is prospective, multi-site study of patient outcomes after implementation of machine learning-based early warning system for sepsis. So it's great to say, hey, we told you we was going to get sepsis, but as a study. But what about if you actually do something about it? Nature Medicine, Roy Adams, Suchi Saria, Johns Hopkins University, and they took this targeted real-time early warning system. They monitored almost 600,000 patients. They found almost 7,000 identified with sepsis before they got antibiotic therapy, and they were able to reduce mortality from 14.6% to 14.6 from 19.2, which is only a 3% decrease in absolute terms, but almost a 20% decrease in relative terms. So really remarkable impact. Let's see, I'm going to speed up a little bit, believe it or not. Reporting outcomes of pediatric intensive care unit patients for referring physicians by electronic health record-based feedback systems, Applied Clinical Informatics, Christina Chipra, Hardeep Singh, University of Iowa College of Medicine, Baylor College of Medicine. And they looked at this. I can't throw this, like, breeding puppies, it's so hard to get rid of some of them. This one, really interesting study. Critically ill children evaluated by frontline clinicians. They developed an outcome feedback system, partly automated, pulls data from the record, and then partly manually. They add manual information to it, and they give it back to the clinician. So I'm going to click through here, click through that. But here's a letter. Dear doctor, remember you sent us that patient and you thought he needed the ICU? Well, guess what? He really did. And, or he didn't, he did okay. And here's why. And, so they give these people the feedback so that they can learn for the next time. And it turns out that it was really, I don't have the outcomes, but it turned out that the clinicians found it very useful. It fit with their workflow very well. They did not show that it changed behavior or improved it. Of course, that's the next study, but really, really, really interesting idea. Okay. Alert burden in pediatric hospitals, cross-sectional analysis of 6 academic pediatric health systems using novel metrics. Evan Ornstein, who's been in this review a couple of times now, Eric Kirkendall, Emory University, and they were looking at alerts per day, alerts per 100 orders, alerts per encounter. I don't know which hospital's which, but I'm pretty sure I'd want to work at the blue hospital and not the yellow one. I mean, those are remarkable, orders of magnitude difference in alerts. And I guess why were the discrepancies? It partly has to do with the history of clinical informatics involvement in building the alerts and developing a culture of monitoring what's been developed and having an active monitoring rationalization program. And so the yellow hospital, not so much. The blue hospital had a very intensive informatics group behind it. And he gave me just some of the stuff, but I'll put this in. All right. Again, in the slides, you can look at the details, and I really got to keep moving. I got so much more to do. Visual analytics, connecting the dots between features of data and data to explain healthcare models. Okay, so machine learning, big problem. You get this output from machine learning, can't understand it. And so they have created a display. Believe it or not, this explains the machine learning, but you'll have to go through step by step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the paper to understand how all these things fit together. But the idea is to give you visual feedback at each part of the machine learning process to better be able to justify the decisions. Okay, tracking patient problem evolution. Little background. Randy Barrows and Steve Johnson, colleagues of mine at Columbia University, wrote a paper on a data model that captures clinical reasoning about patient problems. That was in the AMIA, what preceded the AMIA proceedings. Oh, no, it's the Annual Symposium Computer Applications in Medical Care, or SCAMSI, 1995. So the idea is you have problem X, whatever that is. Let's say I have anemia. That evolves into a diagnosis of iron deficiency anemia on the problem list, and then it might resolve after treatment with iron sulfate. And so this problem that initially started as anemia ends up with a specific ICD-9 code in this case, and then eventually gets resolved. Werner Kusters and Barry Smith at the University of Buffalo built on this idea by having the idea of referent tracking. So they give an identifier to everything in the record, and as things change, they give them new reference. But you can then track how these things change over time. This is 2006, JBI. And the idea was you could, for instance, if you have a new lesion, it would have a different referent than the previous lesion. So you could track whether a previous lesion is getting bigger or not, or whether it's something new. If it transforms from benign to malignant, that's a new referent, but they're connected. And so you can track that change. And then, of course, if somebody has an infection, if it's a recrudescence or it should say reinfect versus reinfection, a recrudescence would have the same referent, and a reinfection would have a new reference. So they had, and of course, if you have an error in the record, like, I thought he had anemia, but it turned out it was something else, or I thought it was iron deficiency anemia, and it turned out he really had, polycythemia, or whatever. He had some other condition. So how do we track that? All right, so a flexible framework for visualizing and exploring patient misdiagnosis over time. Wasala, I don't have time. Widanagamachichi, boy, that's a tough one. And Makoto Jones, University of Utah, tracking diagnostic process to improve accuracy and reduce errors. And they created this framework to be able to display diagnosis over time. I can't go into the detail, but I think you get the idea. People come in diagnosed as UTI, and then they follow them. And some of them continue to say, yeah, they had UTI, but actually they end up having other things as well. And so you can kind of track through. And then you could take the cohort of people that follow the same course, like that band that starts out big at the top, goes down, and then kind of works its way back up through the others. You can take that as a cohort and study it as a single cohort to see what happened. Okay, clinical decision support. Clinical collaboration to improve clinical decision support, the ClickBusters initiative. This is Allison McCoy, Adam Wright, Vanderbilt University. They have a 10-step process for reviewing alerts to minimize unnecessary findings. So a formal review process to look at alerts to try to reduce them. And of course, with any 10-step process, the first step is to admit you have a problem. They had 488,000 alerts firing per week. So I think they had a problem. And so they went through this 10-step process of looking at the alerts, figuring out what was wrong with them, reviewing them with physicians to see if they're worthwhile, are they being overridden, that sort of thing. They did 2 3-month rounds of review of 84 alerts, and they reduced the firings by 70,000. So 15% reduction. It's a modest reduction, but it's a reduction. So going in the right direction. And they also got, in the process, they got increased user engagement and involvement in clinical decision support, because they said, hey, look at this and tell us what's wrong. And they go, I'll tell you what's wrong. And then they said, great, why don't you come to this meeting and tell us what's wrong? And the next thing you know, they're helping out with improving alerts. Genomics and translational bioinformatics. Not my area of expertise, so I often stumble over these, but this is a research agenda to support development and implementation of genomics-based clinical informatics tools and resources, AMIA, and I include it because it's for the first time in about 5 years, somebody picked a paper that I'm actually a co-author on. But I'm one of many, many co-authors. Ken Wiley's the first author, Mark Williams, last author, and this was sponsored by the National Human Genome Research Institute. They have somewhat annual meetings. This was the 13th meeting on developing a clinical genomic informatics research agenda. And I'm going to skip through this. They came up with a whole bunch of desiderata elements that had been developed in previous years, and they compared the ranking from 2014 to 2021. You can see some things have gone up, like top one, maintain separation of primary molecular observations from clinical interpretation. So that has gone up by 8 points, gone up in ranking. Things that have gone down are support individual clinical care and discovery science. I'm not sure why that went down, but that's the consensus, and you can read the details in the paper. Okay, another one from Genomics and Translational Bioinformatics, Snake Venomics, Fundamentals, Recent Updates, and a Look at the Next Decade. In a journal called Toxins, the only paper with a single author, Chu Tan, University of Malaya. And I looked up Venomics in Google and got 84,000 hits, but only 435 of them were venom informatics. And he talks about all kinds of mass spectrometry, proteins, transcriptomics. It turns out that all the toxins, and he claims all the toxins in snake venom have been identified. All these proteins and other things have been identified, but of course we still don't know how they work or the genetics, and there are lots of challenges. There's limited samples, getting non-standardized methods for doing the omics interpretation. Venomic tissue sampling is difficult, especially when there's wildlife restrictions, which there often are in these, endangered animals. Limited resource. So the places where you have most of the snakes are often the less developed regions, and you have neglected species, and there's limited resources for those. And it's snakes and spiders, so that's got to be a challenge, right? Okay, and so they're recommending international collaboration and distributing research support and looking at sort of the international approach to this. And they had a bunch of cool pictures. Oh, are these my pictures? Yeah, pictures of snakes and distributions and that sort of thing. But anyway, all right, moving on. DNA methylation and inherited stress. So many of you know much more than I do about DNA methylation, related methane to methylated cytosine. And when you do that and it happens in a promoter region, it blocks transcription. Okay. And so that actually can be inherited. And that and the stress can be cumulative. So you get your grandmother's stress and your grandfather's stress and your great grandmother's stress, and all of that can accumulate and affect your genome and hence your phenome. So stress increases that. So they looked at DNA methylation signatures of childhood trauma to predict psychiatric disorders and other adverse outcomes. 17 years after exposure, molecular psychiatry, Charlie Van Den Oord and Edwin Van Den Oord and a bunch of other folks that were not named Van Den Oord at Virginia Commonwealth University. And they know the childhood trauma is linked to adverse outcomes that persist into adulthood. And what they wanted to see was this DNA methylation, which would be caused, you would expect, caused by the stress of childhood trauma, does it correlate with later psychiatric problems? And they had specimens going back 17 years on people who had childhood trauma. And they did these assays on 489 participants that were average age 13.6 years at time of their trauma. And now they looked at age 30 years to see. And the scores predicted adult depression, externalizing problems, nicotine dependence, alcohol use, serious medical problems, social problems. And the predictive power was not explained by the trauma or demographic variables or continuity of predicted problems from childhood to adulthood. It was unrelated to those, but it was predictable with the methylation. So that really was an interesting way to look at the stress. And you can think about what implication that has for the children and the grandchildren of people that have undergone stress like this, and of course other kinds of social stress. Consumer health informatics, the challenge of debunking health misinformation in dynamic social media conversations, online randomized study of public masking during COVID-19. So they wanted to look at how do we debunk misinformation that's going through social media. Like, you can post as a sort of an expert and go, hey, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And people look at that and go, okay, but does that really work? How do we, what's the best way to do that? And, it's really a huge problem. And as we know, here in Alabama, for instance. And so they took as an example public masking during COVID-19, Mehdi Morali, Carly Drake, University of Calgary. And so they looked to see if corrections can mitigate impact of misinformation, but they don't know then what happens after that. And so they did a study where they showed people sort of a conversation, because the social media user often rebukes the critic and doubles down on the claim. And, if we're familiar with this all too much. So they looked at the impact of this back and forth of false claims and debunking attempts to see what it would have effect it would have on people's masking. They used 500 U.S. residents. I'm not sure they were in Calgary, but they used U.S. residents, maybe because we have a bigger problem. And they showed them 4 social media things. And I'll show you an example. This is Mask Mouth. So this U Citizen Health does this thing on Mask Mouth. He says, oh, you get all these things from your mask. It sounds very plausible. It's like wearing a soiled diaper all day. You get a diaper rash. And health scientists said, yeah, these are just not correct. It's not supported. Physicians, we wear masks all the time and have been doing it for a long time. We don't have this problem. And so then, of course, the government is going to say that. What do you expect? They make money from this. Here's a picture if you don't believe me. And then health scientists come back. Citizen health is resorting to imagery to provoke an emotional response, blah, 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 back and forth, right? Okay. And so they found misinformation had a negative impact. Debunking initially generally improves attitudes, but the improvement is washed out by further false claims, and this back and forth weakens the belief that there's even an objectively correct answer. And so people go, I don't know what to do anymore. So the conclusion was engaging in extended debate and deniers appears necessary, but more research is needed to address the unintended consequences of such engagement. And it made me think of this XKD cartoon. Are you coming to bed? I can't. This is important. What? Somebody's wrong on the internet. So good luck. Good luck with that. Consumer health information, triage accuracy of symptom checkers, 5-year follow-up. I got to skip to the end here, but they looked at a bunch of symptom checkers that they studied 5 years ago, and they studied them again. And it turns out some are a little better and some are a little worse, but overall, there's not really an improvement in symptom checkers. You think that, 5 years later, they would have learned somehow. Okay. And getting back to the Friedman thing, it turned out that few of the apps outperformed laypersons in either deciding whether emergency care was required or whether self-care was sufficient, and no app outperformed a layperson on both decisions. So there we go. Human better than a computer. I'm not sure, it seems like human plus computer was still not better than a human in contradiction to Friedman's fundamental theorem. All right, so there are lots of overlapping things. Let me see if I can get through these. As I looked at 90-something papers. I presented originally 60. This is probably about 50 here that we present, or they will be by the time I get done. But I saw these overlapping things. So documentation. So AMIA has it's not a work group, it's a task force, the 25x5 task force, with the goal of reducing clinical documentation to 5% of where it is, or 25% of where it is now over the next 5 years. So reduce it by 3/4. And so, that's the quarters there. But there were a bunch of papers in that area. One of them was tackling the burden of electronic health record use among physicians in a mental health setting, physician engagement strategy. Tanya Tajirian, Vicky Sturgiopoulos, Center for Addiction and Mental Health, Toronto, University of Toronto. And they looked at electronic health record systems contributing to physician burnout and developed a physician engagement strategy to focus burden reduction. And they had a whole framework for this. Just show you a screenshot of their system. And this is one physician. And we actually have something like that here, where it's self-reported information. But this is information. I looked at how much time people spent with patients versus how much time they were spent with the EHR to see how much time are you spending on documentation? How does it compare to the rest of your group? Is it changing over time? That kind of thing, to understand how EHR documentation might be contributing to burnout. Now, there's also a diversity, equity, and inclusion is a big topic. And the Consumer Informatics Work Group had a paper, and the Education Work Group had a paper that was in the DEI category. Here's the education when nurturing diversity and inclusion in AI biomedicine through virtual summer program for high school students. So this is actually about using informatics to improve informatics. Tomiko Oskotsky and Marina Sirota, University of California, San Francisco. And so they have an AI for All program at UCSF established in 2019 to increase diversity in artificial intelligence training. They target high school students from underrepresented backgrounds, exactly what we need to be doing. And they got them participating virtually because of the pandemic to see how they did. They let them interact with different role models, that is mentors, and learn about advancing health through AI. They got lectures in coding and AI. They got in-depth research experiences, hands-on projects, and mentoring, personal development sessions, and so on. This is just showing you the diversity of the students, and you can look in the paper. And then this is showing how people's attitudes changed, and the blue is before and the yellow is after. And things on the right, the shift to the right, those are good. So you can see that people's, for instance, I know people within the field of AI who are people of color, and that increased. And so all of those are things like that, raising awareness and helping to improve self-efficacy. All right. Well, there were also, whoops, sorry, where was this one fall? Oh, this is also DEI, knowledge discovery and data mining. So we have a DEI task force, but this is the work groups actually coming up with DEI topics as well. So here's one: AI recognition of patient race in medical imaging, a modeling study from Lancet Digital Health, Judy Gachoya, Horan Zhang at Emory University. So previous studies have shown that AI can detect race from radiographic images. And so the question, though, is how? What's going on? Is it bone density? Is it the amount of fat? Is it fat distribution? Is it disease distribution? And they basically took images where they looked at prediction. Sorry, I took out the predictions. They did various things where they masked things in the radiograph to see, is it the hilum of the lung that's helping? And they really couldn't identify a particular thing that they would remove something and the prediction algorithms would still be accurate. And so the bottom line is, it wasn't related to any of the things that they postulated, wasn't related to the region. And the problem with this is that if you wanted to eliminate this behavior where it's undesirable, for instance, we don't want people predicting race in an anonymized data set, for instance. We're trying to blind people to that. We don't want, there to be, any kind of systematic bias. It'll be difficult to do that. So that was the lesson there. All right, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee or work group, whatever, task force, I forget. They actually had a couple of papers there were 4 papers that were submitted by them. 2 of them, though, overlap in the documentation area. And so here's one: transgender data collection in electronic health records, current concepts and issues. Kronk and Karnofsky, Yale University. There's over 1 million transgender people living in the U.S. 33% report negative experiences with a healthcare provider. I find that number hard to believe, unless there's 66% are just not going to healthcare providers. It's hard to believe. Having close relationships with transgender people, it just seems like that number is artificially low. But have it as you will. How are we representing this information in electronic health records? And how are we even representing sex and gender related information data collection? This was a survey of medical students to see how comfortable are you working with or documenting or talking about patients, transgender patients. How much education have you received in this area? And of course, very low. And they recommended a couple of ways to document transgender, gender in transgenderness, if you will, in the record. One's a one-step method where you have one question: do you consider yourself transgender? Yes, no, something else. And so that's the one-step method. But they actually recommend a 2-step method. So first, what is your gender? Check all that apply. And somebody checked 3 things here, 4 things here, and then wrote gender fluid. And then in the second one, it said, what were you assigned at birth? Which might be useful if you're trying to figure out things like risk of disease that might be related to gender, to body parts, or that sort of thing. So they recommended a 2-step method. So a little more onerous. That goes against our 25 by 5, approach, but there we are. Okay. Let's see. Natural language processing working group. They had some papers on that overlap diversity and documentation. So assessing documentation of social determinants of health for lung cancer patients in clinical narratives, University of Florida. And so they were, of course, social determinants are important factors in cancer risk and treatment outcomes. And it's usually in the free text clinical narratives. The question is, can you use NLP to find it? And is it even there? And so they took 15 categories of social determinants, 10,000, almost 11,000 lung cancer patients to see how often they are there. And here are the 15. So gender, guess what? They were able to find gender almost 99%. And I guess if 98.6 is normal, then we're a little better than normal. Alcohol use is pretty high, drug use, but you get down to things like transportation issues, financial constraints, very low presence of this information in the records, and not surprising. Okay, another group, Women in Informatics. This is a kind of a social group, support group in AMIA. It's not a committee, it's not a work group, but I said, hey, do you guys want to submit papers as well? And they did. They submitted a bunch of papers, and of course, a lot of them had to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a big issue for the women in informatics, and they did a couple of studies of looking at publications, success, and awards, and this one was done looking at acceptance rates at the AMIA annual symposium, which is where I was presenting this. Hartzler, Stippelman, University of Washington, other universities. It was actually a capstone project for the Women in AMIA Leadership Program, which I think I have a slide on also. The co-authors were all scholars in the first year of that program, except Jeff Williamson, Dasha Cohen, who were AMIA staff members, were also co-authors on this. And they used gender to, they assign gender using something called Genderize.io. Go look it up. You can put in a name and it'll suggest what gender it might be. Of course, it's only male, female, so it's missing a lot of things. But they looked at 4,600 submissions and looked at the acceptance rate and also did a sentiment analysis of the review to see if male authors and female authors were treated differently, or if they were treated differently by male or female reviewers. Okay, so first author submissions increased from 38% to 43%, which is, it was probably much higher than 38% overall in 2017, but 43% is about the average in 2020, I think. Women first author acceptance increased from 37% to 44%. Again, that's, so that is, and it was, an overall acceptance rate of 50%. So pretty close to the overall, and that's including everything, papers, panels, posters. The sentiment was the same. Men and women authors were treated the same. Reviewers had different sentiments based on male or female, but they treated male and female authors the same. Men tend to be harsher, women tend to be more constructive, I think was the conclusion. And then just we could see over time, male and female, men are yellow, women are blue, and the proportion, it kind of improved on the research awards. Leadership awards, maybe the numbers are too small to make any generalization, but signature awards kind of have been okay all along. Okay, other one, gender representation in U.S. Biomedical Informatics Leadership and Recognition, JAMIA, Griffin, Chung, University of North Carolina. And so this was data collected from public websites and from AMIA to look at academic leaders in informatics, and they found 74% were men, 83% of the fellowships were programs are led by men, 56% of the AMIA leadership roles are held by men. That's a typo. 64%. So men disproportionately represented, and I could tell you. So there's a graph. We got to wind down here, but I can tell you 100% of the AMIA informatics years in review have been presented by men, and I offered the audience to help me rectify that. Nobody's stepped up yet to take over. Okay, workforce diversity. This is the first look program. I really, unfortunately, don't have time to go into this. Got to get to the end here. This one was a paper on what it means basically to be a woman in informatics or in information management in Saudi Arabia. And they used semi-structured interviews, and it was interesting because what they found was that early in their careers, participants experienced limited opportunities and misperception in general about the field of informatics, but the main challenge was related to the field itself. They did not feel that gender was an issue. And this is Saudi Arabia. So it was interesting that they did not report gender as an issue. They felt empowered based on the Saudi Vision 2030, which is a national program to improve technology. Okay, and so this was another leadership program, and you can see just quickly that numbers improved in self-efficacy, and And that's the same paper. Got to wind down. Ethics, bunch of ethics and social issues. And again, just going to get to the summary here. This is basically showing that people are have been more willing to share their data, whether researchers at their own institutions or elsewhere, even with companies or for-profit companies. That's been about the same. But since the pandemic has changed people's attitude about sharing information, lots of ethical issues around diversity, diversity and inclusion. Health data sharing raises ethical issues. This was about Native Americans. And again, it's so hard to skip these things, because what they looked at is, they talk to people. How do we talk to people that are, in a tribal setting? It turns out you got to bring food, not just for the people you're enrolling, but for their families. And you got to make eye contact, and physical touch is important, things like this. And listen to the community members, also talk to the teenagers and children, and be mindful of the power dynamic between the researchers and the community. All of these great things. And there was one paper that overlapped 3 of these areas, which was really a scoping review of ethical considerations in NLP. And the key takeaway there is that they're adding to the traditional bioethics principles, they're adding justice to the NLP process, and explicability for AI. Okay, so I got lots of papers. I don't know how many were presented here. Majority, a big chunk from AMIA and other informatics journals, less from single entries from many other journals. SARS-CoV-2 has gone down in 2020. It was a hot topic. Now, somewhat less. People were writing reviews. They had 3 systematic reviews, which used to just be reviews, but now it's systematic reviews. Scoping reviews are like the easy version of systematic reviews. And then somebody did a rapid review, which I guess because the scoping review was too onerous. And then 4 cross-sectional surveys were in those 92 papers. So just interesting to see that those methodologies were, it's not that they're increasing, but they are ones that are being felt to be significant papers by the working groups. And this will just kind of blow through here, the connections between the different groups. The thicker lines mean more papers. Purple is 1, and blue is 2, and the yellow is 4, I think. And it's just different connections. And I'm going to skip down to the next slide. And again, you can get the slides. You can look at all these things. You can see, sort of where the cross sections are for whatever that's worth. But this is the other thing I thought interesting is that the groups that talk about documentation and the groups that talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Those were the 2 big themes overarching that were different this year than in previous years. Okay, there's the papers, and I will roll credits. Let me see if I can open up the chat. I see 2 things in the chat. Let's see, this is where will you send the link? The link is on the last page, but we'll send it out to the distribution list. We'll have a recording too for people that, want to hear this at Alabama speed instead of New York speed. Other questions while we're waiting? I'm not sure why the credits have stopped. But I'll watch.
I have a quick question on the showing the cross domains. You have all the different arrows and everything.
Yeah,
they looked like they were one-sided arrows. Was there some directionality to them, or it was just?
Yeah, it was papers from the working group that referenced the topic of other working groups.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks.
So sometimes there will be in both directions. If there were papers, if there were papers by both. Whoops, here we go. All right, well, I'm going to skip this because nobody's going to read all these things, but you can read them at your leisure, just to get a sense of the size of this project. And there we go. Oh, but I have to do the animation. The animation's so cool. That was the last one. All right, there we go. All right, so that's the whole bibliography, and there's the link to the slides. And I see we're at 11 o'clock, so somehow this timed out well. And I apologize for skipping over things, but you can see my dilemma. I'm so enthusiastic about a lot of these things, and I learn so much when I do this. It's really fun to do. And now, starting tomorrow, I will start forgetting all these things until I give this talk again for somebody. Okay.
Once again, thanks. Great presentation. Thanks everybody for attending. I don't know. I think we're at time, so I don't think we have any time for questions, but you can always email Dr. Cimino if you have any questions.
Yep.
Thanks for attending again, and happy Thanksgiving. And see you in the next PowerTalk.
Thanks for joining, folks. Take care.
Bye.
How do I stop? There we go.